Now that we've built the model and know where the shocks fit, let's try and describe the world around us. What happens when the US increases tariffs on goods imported from China? Two things. First, we will get less imports. That's the direct effect. Because GDP is C plus I plus G plus NX, and that NX is net exports or exports minus imports. Having less imports means aggregate expenditures go up. So we get a rightward shift in the IS curve. But something else happened. This isn't just one kind of shock. Now that we no longer can have access to as efficient and cheaply produced goods, our economy is not as efficient as it used to be. This is a negative productivity shock. The Phillips curve is going to move up. Let's get our new equilibrium, higher GDP, bring that down to the Phillips curve, and we get some inflation from two sources, both from moving along the Phillips curve, a positive demand shock, as well as a shift in the Phillips curve, a negative supply shock. But we're not done. Do you think China's going to do nothing with these tariffs? No, they're going to have their own retaliatory tariffs. So now when China responds with their own tariffs, US exports to China will decline. We export a lot of soybeans, for example. With less exports means we shift the IS curve back. I'll label these points here. This is 1, this is 2, this is 3, this is both 0.0 and 0.4. So now we shift back along our new Phillips curve, and what do we get? We still have some inflation, but nothing changes in regard to the output gap. Did we see this? Absolutely. Not only was it initially very inefficient and unproductive to save the jobs via those tariffs. For example, the initial tariffs on washing machines meant that US consumers are now paying $90 more for their washers and dryers. It did save manufacturing jobs, but at a cost to the US economy of $800,000 per job. Those manufacturing jobs did not have a salary of $800,000. That is just a measure of the waste. Once China implemented their tariffs, this paper here calculates that no jobs were saved on net. So what did we get? Higher inflation and no improvement in economic activity. Let's go back a decade. What would happen to the United States economy if the Eurozone experienced a Great Depression due to the Greek and Italian debt crises of 2012? This was a very real possibility. There were many in Europe who were hesitant to give large emergency loans to Greece to prevent a huge catastrophic collapse. But why should the US care? Well, first thing, Europe buys a lot of American goods. Canada and Mexico, as we would expect, purchase the bulk of our exports. But in purple here, we see Europe is a very large component. This would be a negative shock to our IS curve, but there's going to be a larger effect. This graph shows the U.S. direct investment abroad in 2012. Over 56% of U.S. private investment holdings are located in Europe. This is the equivalent of 15% of United States GDP. So if Europe is experiencing a Great Depression, the United States in turn will lose out on money, and it will harm our economy. And we can see exactly how in the model. This means financial opportunities are far more risky. And so in the U.S. economy, the MP curve is going to shift up. Label them 1 and 2. For both of these reasons, the output gap declines drastically, and we get a large negative demand, decline in the inflation rate, and a major recession on hand. The world is very interconnected. We want everybody to succeed. All right, it's time to do COVID. First things first, big negative supply shock. No one going to work. Working from home is not as efficient to begin with. Factories are getting shut down temporarily. But no one's buying stuff either. So we have a big negative demand shock and a big negative supply shock. Which one was bigger at first? Well, we initially observed some deflation. So the demand shock was bigger than the supply shock. Inflation goes down briefly. But a bunch of things happened. We had significant fiscal stimulus, large monetary policy stimulus, no financial crisis to speak of, much lower interest rates. We'll call that the Fed stimmy right there. And we'll call this the fiscal stimulus or the direct checks that everybody liked. Label these 0, 1, 2, and then 3. And after a year or so, the output gap was recovering. But the supply chain effects took a long time to fix. And so that's why we saw, after the recovery, high levels of inflation. Was that IS curve too far to the right? Did they overcompensate? This is still up for debate. And finally, we're going to end this video talking about the great granddaddy of all, the Great Depression of the 1930s. Number 1, stock market crash of 1929, higher risk premium. That's bad news. There's 1, there's our start, negative demand shock, a little bit of deflation. Number 2, in 1932, Congress was very worried about a balanced budget. They thought a balanced budget was causing the depression, and so they raised taxes. But when you raise taxes, it's going to slow down spending. Negative spending shock. Number 2, more deflation. But we're not done. The central bank didn't fix the situation. They let the money supply shrink. They wanted interest rates to be higher to make the US a more attractive investment from abroad. Higher interest rates mean people might bring their money here. Well, they didn't because they were also in a recession. This time because the Fed was raising interest rates on their own. They did the opposite of what they're supposed to do. I'm running out of room on my little graph. That's point 3. More deflation. Well, we're not done. In 1930, they wanted to decrease imports to help maybe boost exports to help us get out of the economy. And so they passed the very infamous Smoot-Hawley Act. Here is a picture of Reed Smoot on the right and Willis Hawley on the left. Here's a 150-year history of tariffs. We can see right here in 1930, they raised tariffs to 60%. It is a huge tax rate. And what will it do in our model? Now, at first we might think, less imports, higher GDP, but we've done this before. Big tariffs that we impose are almost always followed by retaliatory tariffs from Europe and our other trading partners, which they did, drastically harming the economy yet again. As both a negative demand shock as people stop buying our exports, and a productivity shock from harming our potential output. But we're not done. I know. It just kept getting worse. It's not called the Great Depression for nothing. It's been a few years now. Prices have been deflating. Businesses and farmers can't pay back their old loans that are denominated in old prices because their new revenues are coming in new prices, but the new prices are lower. And so they can't pay them back. And if you can't pay back your loan, the bank is gonna fail. And we saw this. Banks continued to default years into the Great Depression. This is raising our MP curve yet again. I'm losing count. I think this was number 5. This one was supposed to be 4. And that one was 3 there. Over and over again, there were mistakes made that exacerbated the trajectory of the macroeconomy. This is what became known as the debt deflation hypothesis. It's a vicious cycle of deflation, causing banks to collapse, causing macroeconomic activity to decline, which causes further deflation, which causes more loans to default, which cause more banks to decline into that vicious doom cycle. So, what got us out of the Great Depression? The short version. The banking system did eventually work its way through the bad debt, but it took years. And some of those New Deal projects did shift that spending curve outward. Although in 1937 they did make the mistake of trying to balance the budget again. The unemployment rate went from 11% in 37 back up to 19% in 1938. The United States also got off of the gold standard, and we kind of see that the sooner a country got off the gold standard, the easier it was for financial conditions and financial flows to even out. The quicker a country got out of their depression. This would help lower the MP curve. And then finally World War II began, which involved government spending larger than anything seen in the New Deal era. That's your macroeconomy. Thanks for hanging out. See y'all next time.